That's
Good,
good.
good. Well, I've enjoyed our exchanges. I this morning remembered Levinas, who I think is
Yeah.
actually a key component of this whole discussion about
Mm.
Nietzsche, because I remembered this book on Nietzsche in Levinas. I don't remember this being a good book, but Levinas was someone a
Mhm.
long time ago I read, but his critique of Heidegger, because now the entire internet thinks that apparently I don't think Heidegger has any space for relations when his whole idea is to break down the separation of this, the individual from the world. I mostly mean relationships is what I'm talking about. And I think that came out in our talk. But Levinas basically comes up to Heidegger and says, hey, Dasein is antisocial. Like Dasein
Mm.
is an isolated unfolding that is antisocial. And Leibniz goes from there and he talks about the phenomenology, the encounter of the face, and so on and so forth. What I think Levinas, oh, Tyler's here too. What Levinas does not fully appreciate is that not going through Dasein is antisocial too. You see, that's what we're trying to kind of talk about. Like, if you don't go and develop the ability to hold individuals in the right way, then that's actually antisocial because it becomes pathological. There's something interesting where Dasein is a necessary risk of being antisocial, and yet it is also a prerequisite of being social. And the more and more we think about this philosophical development, I can never say this word, this philosophical developmentism, the more things can kind of fit together. Because then you say, well, without Nietzsche, the ego doesn't become an I, therefore can't handle holding suchness. But then if you hold suchness, it can be, the very fact that you have the success of the suchness, it can be very difficult to bring that into the society and maintain it because it is such a difficult act, let alone get to the becoming other of Hegel. And the other way I've been thinking about this week, it's kind of the notion where in the New Testament, when they go up on the mountain and they have like a beatific vision, they see Jesus talking with the prophets, and it's like the transfiguration. And yet they come down back off the mountain and they still abandon Jesus, right? Like they have this transfigurative experience, but they're not able to sustain or maintain what they learned from it. There's something, when I think about Heidegger, it seems very difficult to almost get that ability to encounter, to let beings be, to let things unfold their beings, and then take that and apply it to other people. It seems notably difficult to maintain with other people. And it's like, that's kind of how I'm thinking about it and kind of situating it together. And Tyler, great to see you. You're a beautiful soul. So, seeing Heidegger, and I think Levinas is an angle, but I'd have to go back and read a lot of his works. But I actually forgot, frankly, about Levinas kind of approaching this question. I remember thinking that Levinas was problematic and that I did prefer Buber. But even Buber, until you brought him back up, I had not read for 8 or so years. Same with
Mm.
Levinas, and I'm thinking there are resources there.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot. I've been rethinking a lot too. Um, Now I'm looking at Nietzsche in the sense of, so Nietzsche, it's Nietzsche, I think this is what I'm thinking now. Nietzsche is a natural philosopher
Mm.
of the body. Um, I think it's actually even interesting because if you read Nietzsche in tandem with Buber, you get this sense of, Buber says something very fascinating in the sense of that in order you have nature gives rise to spirit. And that would be where Nietzsche stays in the realm of nature, godless Zarathustra. Buber takes you, how do we rise from nature to spirit?
Mm.
Um, Now, does that succeed? I don't really know, but I do think there is this way in which Nietzsche is this step in, he's this unlearning in which we have to learn to be natural. Um, what does that mean? I think that is the whole exploratory question of Nietzsche. Like, what does it mean to be natural? And in that question, that is sort of beyond good and evil. But then also, I read the passage between the gravity of the spirit where he actually says what Nietzsche is against in good and evil is not, he's against the universalization of good and evil. It's about finding your particular good and evil, which I think is very important because if we bring back C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianities, um, C.S. Lewis says something fascinating in the sense of, look, just because you can do good things doesn't mean that you're actually good, because that is probably something more towards your natural predisposition,
Right.
right? So I think Nietzsche is actually capitalizing on that. He's saying yeah, sure, you give to charity, you do all these good things, but that's not actually doing good
Right.
because that is something that you already do without really trying. In comparison to the man that actually struggles with himself, I think the Pale Criminal is a perfect example of that, where he's struggling with himself. He doesn't see the value. He doesn't see himself as he is, the lust for the knife. So he steals instead to make value out of it. But if he would have just, like, I think it's a very clever line. Nietzsche says he was justified when he did it, meaning like this was his particular evil. That's how I interpret it. This was his particular evil. But he becomes a pale criminal once he decides to do something else to cover it up. And so in some sense, he's not really dying to self here. And that's the critique of the judges, is like, you're going to judge him, but you're not facing up to your own particular evil, right? Because judging is rather easy to do. And so I think that's why I'm starting to stay in the realm of like Nietzsche is more of the natural philosopher, where you need that sort of naturalness to sort of move and give rise to spirit in a more holistic way. Because then we get corruption of spirit, right? If we don't have like a nice justified naturalness to it. I mean, that's how I'm wanting to connect, going from Nietzsche to Buber.
No, I mean a few things. One, the language of pale criminal is funny because pale is in not even a good criminal, like pale, like you pale in comparison, but then pale isn't dying. And there's something about the problem with being a pale criminal is that you don't quote unquote own what you're doing, right? And you don't see yourself in the natural and the actual. The other thing Nietzsche is critiquing is there tends to be through society an assumption that struggle in a person's life is evidence they're doing something wrong. Like if they're struggling with something, that's evidence that there's a problem. And Nietzsche comes along and he's like, no, actually the lack of struggle could be an evidence that there's a problem. And that would fit perfectly with Hegel, right? And that's where Dr. Last's work is very, very good. So I don't know. I tell you what. So, for a long time, there's an assumption that struggle equals problem, where Nietzsche is like, no, not necessarily. In the same way that when, we were talking about Nietzsche versus Chesterton, whatever, one of the things of Chesterton and a lot of the thinkers of the beginning of that, and even when you get up to Moldermann, I guess, in the 70s, and he's still alive, where he's even basically saying that the God of Christianity is the crucified God, there's this switch from really focusing on the resurrection and heaven to the act of crucifixion itself. And like a switch to really looking at suffering. And what Nietzsche is basically, and so you could say in some respects saying, is that Christianity, Platonic Christianity is dead. People don't even know it. Like these people, he's saying the people in the square in the Madman, they're already atheists. Actually, it's not that they're religious laughing at him. They don't believe. And he's like, and what the Madman is screaming, warning about. He's like, you don't see the inevitable place that your lack of a belief is leaving. You take this you're laughing. You don't think it's a big deal. God's silly. It's like, you don't understand what a big seismic shift this is. So it's very important to realize that the Madman is speaking to people who are atheists that do not understand what the depths of atheism mean. And he has concluded basically that we can't go back to Christianity. Therefore, we've got to figure this out. Now, someone like Chesterton, Mortimer, and N.T. Wright, different people are like, well, wait, maybe there's a way to take Christianity that's based on First Temple Judaism versus Second Temple Judaism that is not going to be Platonic and actually integrate the Nietzsche critique to suffer, to crucify, to dwell and live with other people, and not see the act of living with the sinner as what you need to do to get to heaven, but actually heaven on earth itself. So this kind of inversion of bringing, making heaven God's dwelling place as opposed to a realm. And if God is within you, then, heaven is here where two or more gathered and the Spirit is there. Now, of course, that doesn't mean earth equals heaven fully, but the language becomes, instead of separate to not fully, it's a glass darkly. Like this realm is in fact going to be the heavenly realm. It's just not fully there yet. And that's kind of what C.S. Lewis is bringing out in the end of the Chronicles of Narnia, where blue is more like blue. People are more not people. It's not what you escape, but where fullness is realized. So the Nietzschean critique, there is a version of Christianity that comes after that was always there. I mean, it's there in the mystics, but it really starts to come out after Nietzsche because of this notion that we should not assume struggle equals bad or something of that nature. and Nietzsche, and that's very useful. To bring up Mr. Tyler's work, there's something about when we like at Voicecraft, there's this real infinite emphasis on awareness of the dynamics of conversation, the dynamics of how people relate, how they think about one another, what's going on, and there's a sense in which that's Heideggerian in the sense that you're trying to hold the relationship in a manner that you are aware of the meta dimension, so that you're holding people in the right way. But there is this entirely new way you have to think about relation. And for me, when we talk about a transition from, say, Nietzsche to Heidegger or Heidegger to Buber, the phenomenology of voice actually becomes a really big deal. I call it the phenomenology of voice, a lot of what Voicecraft does, and I'd be interested what Tyler thinks. But there's really like drawing attention to the very dynamics of interaction that emerge between people, that is not merely, say, expressing the emotions that are felt, but asking questions of why are those emotions felt? What do those emotions mean? Phenomenology is so close to counseling, and if counseling is extremely important, is not a bad thing, but there's also an examination of the dynamics themselves, not simply a question of what are the, how do we reach a resolution? How do we reach a certain unity and overcome this? But instead, it's like, no, what are the dynamics of which create tension, and how can that tension be generative? What's good tension? What's bad tension? And that's all a phenomenological endeavor. And for me, one of the reasons I greatly appreciate Voicecraft is precisely because of that phenomenology of voice, which seems to be an utterly necessary component of the question of this philosophical developmentism, which, if we go from ego to I suchness, I, you, and then even I/you, and in Hegel, that phenomenology of voice seems utterly critical. Yeah, I just wanted to say hi, Mr. Jockin, and there's Mr. Tyler.
Hey, everybody.
Look at that beautiful soul. How you doing, Tyler? Look at that man sitting down. Tyler is so great. Tyler is so great. How you doing today?
I did hear my name, though.
Yeah, you did.
Good. It's a good day.
Okay.
I mean, it's not over. We're roughly halfway through all the good stuff anyways. The kids are at school, so when I get all the good stuff done. Okay, so I was walking around the room, but I overheard initially some discussion about, it seemed like a separation between terms of nature and spirit. And I'd like to ask some more clarification on that. What's your felt sense of that separation? Because when I replay my existence in this world, if you wanted to respond right away, go ahead. No.
The way I read Buber and the way I understood it was there isn't like a separation of, there's an arising out of. So it's like, it becomes like, the way I look at it, it's kind of like this grounding and then kind of like a blooming upwards. That's the way I look at it, right? There's this blooming upwards.
Right.
So yeah, I didn't associate it with like a separation of, but I was saying like, if we look at Nietzsche as a sort of like natural philosopher, like there's this, line where he's like, the body's the self, and then like, all this stuff, like this grounding ourselves in the naturalness. I think when we looked at Buber saying, okay, well, instinctually, what happens when we ground ourselves in this naturalness is that spirit arises. Spirit reveals itself. I think that's maybe a better term to put it. Spirit reveals itself to us. So yeah, that would be like my elaboration on that.
Perfect. Thank you. That distinction, or the development of that distinction, the developing awareness of that distinction, I remember it as being something like, and observing this in my own children, that there's a participatory element of this where consciousness is developing, where you're just in and amongst the motions of the world, right? And you develop over time senses of resistance to change, right? So there are things that are ongoing, and then you begin to participate in states in the world. And so there begins to be a distinction between things that are still and immobile, right? Which are resistant to gravity. So I developed this distinction that I have a desire to move something, and there's a resistance associated with that. And so there's a relationship between my will and this resistance. And then there's this other category that has to do with recognizing that split between the intention of myself and the motion and the resistance, and allowing for that to be that distinction, and then recognizing that in other things which are also moving. Right, so that they're partaking of that same separate distinction of a will which experiences resistance. So that that split between the felt inner's subjective will and the resistance to things in the world, that's that really curious part that I'm well, and so just to jump it into what you guys were just discussing with regards to the phenomenology of voice. There's something about container, right? This idea of a well, let's make a mystical pun, a hermetically sealed container, which prevents a recognition of the relationship between like the subtle nuances out there and the subtle nuances in here. There's like a severing of the relationships by this hard boundary condition, and recognizing that that is not actually the case, that's more like a linguistic construct, because we get situated within these deep patterns of thinking in certain ways, which relate to this developing pattern of seeing the world with regards to containers, right? And this separation between transformation and objectification. So those are kind of some scattered abstract thoughts about that, but this idea of being able to be present with all four of us here, I'm assuming Thomas is also present, but right, and then to recognize like what I am truly engaging in right now, and then where my will meets the will of you, right? Like how that is actually informing what's occurring in this space. And then we're also bringing in all these weird like historical tendrils, which are coming through us, where that's that kind of blooming phenomenon, right? Which has persisted, right? And some amount of contingency from then till now, and it's transformed itself over time. That talking about these things in abstract terms, I'm always like yanked back out, observing the process of what's occurring. Right? Like that's where I wind up, and I'm always trying to find a way to make it more concrete with regards to what's happening right now, like what's actually happening right now. Trying to keep my my being present. I was reading up on some of these lovely people you guys keep mentioning, so I want to throw this in there, and then we can maybe see if it has any value. This distinction in like the whole structuralist, post-structuralist argument with regards to absence and presence in the nature in which we communicate. That this is something I think is really vital, because there's some aspect of this which seems to say there is a fundamental difference between speech and writing, right? That I can be present with you in speech, but not in writing. And I have spoken with so many people that I was absolutely sure were not present with me while they were speaking. There's an assumption there, which I think is quite interesting. So I'm curious about the generativity of language with regards to where it's actually arriving from. Because it seems like those who I'm speaking with who are not actually present are essentially they're just the mechanism by which prior existent states are coming forward, right? And I'm not really able to interact with them directly, right? Because there isn't a sense that transformation is occurring or can occur in the moment.
That was really well put, Tyler. A few things. First off, a lot of the notion that speaking is present and writing is not, I think is, I hate to be mean, but there's some simplicity to it. Because there is an idea that actually sometimes people feel like they can tell the truth in writing precisely because they're not there. Like they don't have to worry about the encounter of others and the judgment that can come. Whereas sometimes when we're in somebody's presence, we're actually given ways of, dare I say, performance by which we can divert the person from the truth, precisely because there is the facial body, the movement, the ability to walk across the room and leave at the moment it gets uncomfortable. And so there are ways to actually divert what's going on. basically, for me, one has to see writing and, say, speaking, if we stay there, as entirely different acts, not different approaches to the same activity, because that distinction, say, between presence and absence really emerges when you say, well, both are communication. One is presence and the other is absent. It's like, no, they're both different art forms that do different things, that follow different rules at different times and have different things, and both are a mixture of presence and absence. And actually, that very distinction between presence and absence that comes up in the structuralist, pro-structuralist debate, I think actually that could have used a better understanding in some respects of what Heidegger wanted to do. And that would be, because that right there, as Heidegger wants to get rid of the notion of the subject-object, the subjectivity-objectivity, that divide, and basically saying, no, there's always a relation, and that relation itself is what you have to discuss to the point where it has its own ontological weight. Now, the point I've been making is that the question is, does that relation translate readily into relationships? Or is there another schoolship? Is there another skill set that has to be gained in order to sustain that? In the same way that does Nietzsche's love of life, does that readily translate into a love of other people? Sure, it might be a necessary component of the love for other people, but it is also using love in different senses, right? So likewise, when Heidegger talks about the relation to the point where it's not even really a relation anymore, it's just being, it just is being, and it's almost strange to call it a relation, even if it's constituted by a kind of relation. Can that suchness in of itself give one the resources they need to enter into relationships and hold them? And that, to me, has now a way to think about that is framed from, is it enough to simply go to, say, the mountaintop of transfiguration, have a mystical experience, and come back to normal life and be good to go forever? Right? Like, are you set now that you've had that experience? And the answer following, say, theology is no, actually. You can have these great mystical experiences. And I think actually you can almost empirically have evidence for it, for how many people will have real near-death experiences and then enter depression afterwards. They'll have near-death experiences and then afterwards be very depressed. But some people have near-death experiences and then their entire life changes and they relate to people better. And it's very interesting how it goes one way versus the other, and the question would be why. That would actually almost be a study that you could do on this kind of question of how suchness translates into daily life. I think Scott McKnight actually did an extensive study on near-death experiences, but I would have to look into that. I think it would actually have some useful resources. The other thing I will say is Heidegger is, one of the big mistakes that Heidegger has for Western philosophy is that it has tried to overcome interpretation, as opposed to understand that interpretation is what constitutes Dasein. Like, Dasein is an interpreting being. It is a being of whom interprets. So if you're trying to escape interpretation because you're like, well, if it's interpretation, it's subjective, therefore it is not true. Well, then it's kind of a death drive, right? Kind of an effacement drive. It's a bad thing because you cannot leave behind interpretation without leaving behind what makes Dasein Dasein. But one of the reasons he wants to move from subject to Dasein is because it's so freaking difficult to engage in a form of to approach interpretation that actually is not misguided. So, for example, a lot of people say, as a subject, if you interpret, you look for emotions, you look for things that are in the realm of the subject. And what Heidegger wants to do is for us to approach interpretation from the place where being is a question. So he's going to bracket out subject to Dasein and say, what is the nature of interpretation for Dasein as opposed to a subject? And that would be a question of being. And so everything becomes about how does one engage in interpretation in a way that lets beings sign forth as themselves, right? So this is what's kind of funny because, there's kind of this notion with Kant where Kant's like, well, you can't cross the noumenon, you can't get to things in themselves. You're stuck in the phenomenon because you're stuck in your own phenomenon. So Heidegger comes along and he's like, okay, we can't cross the noumenon, but what if we could hold things in such a way that the things come across the noumenon to us? That's kind of a way I would put it. We can't cross the noumenon, but is it possible for us to hold things in a manner that they cross the noumenon to us and give them their being in of themselves? Is that possible? Is there a way one can hold themselves so that things can come across the noumenon toward us as opposed to go the other way? And of course, that would entail complexifying what exactly is the noumenon and so forth. All of that is an art of interpretation. All of that is an art of hermeneutics. And to tie it to what we were saying with voicecraft, voicecraft is taking awareness of the dynamics that emerge in a hermeneutical situation so that one can master them in a skillful and artful way, thus increasing the probability that people come across the noumenon, quote unquote, toward us, as opposed to us trying to cross there. And that sounds kind of funny, but it's like a way to engage in dynamics so that the you of people can shine forth into our interpretation, as opposed to being impeded by interpretation. And that sort of practice, to me, seems to be what is at the cross point between Heidegger and Buber, if we keep using this language. Now, this assumes we've gone from ego to I following a Nietzsche and a Kierkegaard. But once we go that from Heidegger, we're now kind of lurking on this question of what is the movement from Heidegger to Buber, which is where I was saying Levinas seems to have some relevancy, and I had just forgotten about him. But that transition point seems to have a lot to do with learning the art of the phenomenology of voice, the art of hermeneutics, so that things can shine forth into interpretation, as opposed to be impeded by interpretation if we're following a Heideggerian structure. And that seems to be the question. How does one do this?
Oh, do we have an answer for that one?
Well, let me check my notes.
Okay, so I think, so with regards to like, so there's a metaphysical domain to this, but there's clearly a physical domain to this. I have brain structures which accompany, strongly correlated with certain types of thinking. And we know this because developmentally we can track these accretions of capacities in children, right? Like you can see how they become aware of like the permanence problem, right? So before 6 months, they see a ball go behind a wall and the ball literally is just gone. It disappears. There's no persistence of the object within the memory. But at some point, you have the capacity to retain that existence as a veiled aspect of the world, right? You recognize for the first time that something can exist and also be hidden.
Right.
That thing right there, like that moment when you realize that, it's surprisingly, it's surprising how early children learn to dissimulate, to lie, right?
Yeah.
Are you holding a ball and the whole, behind their back? They know very quickly there's a hiddenness that they can engage in. Right now, that hiddenness is the problem I see with this push towards needing the other to express their being, because there's always the possibility of dissimulation. There's always the possibility of not just nature being veiled or hidden, right, or spirit being veiled or hidden, but it actively attempting to portray itself as something otherwise. This is a very serious, and often not confronted aspect of the nature of communication. Absolutely. Right? We kind of partition it into weird places like debates on YouTube or legal jurisprudence or something, right? Like attorneys will do the arguing for us. But this idea of being fundamentally aware of an interpretive structure that you're engaging in, it has to do with this truth-falsity test. That capacity, that ability to discern, I think, is a vital skill that has to be developed over time, and also an easy one to misappropriate. So.
Well, I will add just to that. This is why, for me, skipping Nietzsche or skipping Kierkegaard and going straight to relationships is a problem, because Nietzsche is stressing so much of the staying true, love of life, affirming what is actual and not lying. When he talks about beyond good and evil, it's actually almost to get at real good and evil, because he's critiquing moralities that make it okay, say, to be a hypocrite, or okay to lie, or okay to engage in problematic activities. And the problem is, like, why I recall not liking Levinas too much, although again, this was 10 years ago and I just picked up the book because I remembered him this morning of perhaps being useful here, is because Levinas criticizes Heidegger as basically being kind of antisocial, and he's kind of critical of this development of the individual because we realize our fullness in community. But my critique is like, well, sure, Levinas, there's something that could be antisocial. There is something antisocial about Dasein, precisely because the community can keep Dasein from making being a question. But there's also something antisocial about not going through Dasein, by not learning how to hold. There's something antisocial about Nietzsche, absolutely. But there's also something antisocial about not going through Nietzsche, because you don't gain the resources to resist the disassociations that you were talking about in those different practices. So this is why a structure of philosophical developmentism seems so important, where we see each one of these stages as a necessary stage in an overall picture. And that's why I think it's been so terrible that philosophy has mostly been structured as a history, not a developmentalism. Now, there's something about history that entails progress, but not really, not in this sort of structured way that, for me, the only, Hegel's a good example of someone who has a structure. But also I want to kind of blend the structure with Dante, because I think Dante has a very important structure, because he has certain components that are very useful, especially on the notion that God's hiddenness is an act of love, because otherwise it would overwhelm you. Likewise, if the ego tries to engage in suchness, it gets overwhelmed and it becomes pathology. So you need some of these Dante resources, and then I'll pass this on. The last thing I'll say is a lot of this is interesting to me, because the philosophical developmentalism seems like we've talked a lot about Kafka, Black Mirror, being captured, being stuck in a quote unquote net. And there's something about exploring how to escape that net that seems tied to a philosophical developmentism. Something about that seems connected to this question of how does one escape the revolution being captured by the system of control? How does one escape ending up in a Kafka story where you participate in the very mechanism of control? Like, how does one escape the net, per se? Well, it would seem to have some sort of negation of that net into something communal that involves IU, but then there's a certain philosophical developmentism that makes it possible to engage in that and to sustain that must be done so that one can overcome, so that the net can become a connection, like an internet where people are connected, as opposed to something that captures. So it's interesting because these things seem connected to me.
Back on interpretation, if we want to use, keep using the phenomenology of the voice, it would be like a real relation would almost seem like it's the meeting of interpretations, right? The meeting space of interpretations. And I think the Buber language would be like, are you actually allowing another interpretation to present itself rather than it being like a sort of monologue? Are you sort of like imposing an interpretation of presenting that hides the other, like it sort of hides the other? And I think that's why I like Buber so much, and I've been trying to, some of my other side work, Daniel, is like I'm trying to find, I do like your idea of like finding a developmentalism, but now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sort out what is the development within Buber's own system.
Sure.
Because I think the problem is, is like I've read this book twice now, I and Thou, and my only impression was like, okay, there's I in it and there's I and Thou, right? This is like a very broad understanding of it. But then you start thinking like, okay, there's actually some type of developmental process that Buber is alluding to, which, I've always liked his realm of distinction between nature, spirit, and man, where nature, you're doing the addressing, but all of a sudden in spirit, you're being addressed.
Right.
So I do find it like this, there's like this ironic thing with Nietzsche where he's teaching you how to address.
Oh, yeah.
Right? How do you address? But then Buber comes along and he's like, it's not only about how do you address, it's about how do you learn to be addressed as well.
Right.
And I think it's that learning of like, how do I be addressed? Which, going back even to the child's experience, Buber would say, I've been actually, the most hard concept of Buber that I've been trying to understand is his notion of experience. Because he says, oh, you can't experience the thou. It's nothing. It's not anything. But then he says something like, the child, when he's holding a teddy bear, he's not experiencing it as an object. He's corresponding with it. So I'm starting to get the sense that actually what Buber means by no experience is by simply being in the midst of being addressed and addressing back, right? I think that's actually what Buber's saying. He's like, that's not experience. Experience is always something already in the past for Buber. Experiencing an object, experience a thing. But the moment you are in that realm of addressing and being addressed, you're present. You're not experiencing. Which is interesting because I'm like, that's still experiencing, you know? I'm like, I'm still trying to grasp it, but I think Buber's just saying that's not experiencing of an object. That is a real meeting, and that's not experience. Yeah.
No, I mean, a few things. I mean, as I understand Levinas, who seems very useful here, it is precisely the reason that the encounter of the other is so paramount to the development, to spirit, you could say, is precisely because of the scandal of the other, that they are different, that they aren't similar, and that it is so difficult to know what to do. And there's a sense in what Levinas is saying is that when an experience that doesn't have that level of intensity is not even an experience. Like, there's a sense in which you go through life, if you're not ever encountering the other, it's not really an experience. It's more like sleepwalking. It's more like kind of just mindlessly going through. It's more like absorbing than it is kind of experiencing. Experiences, as I take Buber to have, it has a certain intensity to it, and that is rare. And also, he seems to bring out that when he's kind of like, you can't sustain now, it's very important. He says quite clearly in I and Thou that no one can sustain the thou forever, the you. You have to eventually go back into the it in the you. This is another reason why I think thinking Buber in terms of Hegel is useful, because Hegel is about advancement through failure, right? There's this kind of like failure, this inability that then is you're negated. But then that negation actually is sublated because you take that failure and it somehow improves. You know, you kind of like, well, let me try again, and I'll try in a different way, and then in a different way, and you're transformed in every single one of those reconstitutions with the RE in parentheses. I think for me, Buber comes out in that framework. Without an explicit. Now, I'm not sure, because I'm not an extraordinary, some sort of Buber scholar. I don't, that sort of structure of intentional failure that kind of can be brought out in Hegel might need to be more dressed up, dare I say, more elaborated on. That would be a matter of debate. But there is something about Buber that is tragic, that needs to be kind of structured for. I don't take it, you can read the IU and have this sense of, oh, it's like a parody, it's like a perfect unity sort of thing. And no, there's much more of a intentional failure structure that's going on in it that I think is very important. And Chetan, Sam, wonderful to see you. A question I had, and then I'll pass it on, is it's kind of funny, Sam did one of my favorite Kafkas with the little parable on the notion of the mouse, and the mouse is like, oh me, oh my, how can I escape? There's a trap up the head where I go, and the cat's like, you simply change your direction, and ate up the mouse. There's a sense in which the cat addressed the mouse, told the mouse where it was, told the mouse what it needed to do, told the mouse, and yet proceeded to eat it. Right. So there's a sense in which address, even if it's like the correct motions, is not fully met if the one who is speaking then doesn't follow through with that. The cat didn't let the mouse go in the other direction. It told them, it unveiled the truth, but then it became a great mockery, as opposed to a something that would actually help the mouse. There's a similar way in which every one of these stages we're describing, if you try to go into Heidegger without Nietzsche, it becomes a great mockery because you can't handle the suchness. If you try to go into Buber without developing the ability to hold and let beings come forth, it becomes a great mockery because you find out your inability. And so there's this need actually to have every other stage so that the other stages actually don't turn out to be a kind of mockery or a kind of tragedy against you. Because even if you get the right information, you indeed try to enter IU, the cat tells you what you need to do. Buber tells you need IU. Without the right conditioning, you're not able to handle it. And, in this example, it's not Buber that's eating you, it's you eating yourself per se. But there's that sort of the right information can actually be tragic if it is not followed by the right action or the ability to sustain that.
Yeah, I actually saw the cat, I interpreted it as when the cat ate the mouse, it was like killing the mouse's rationality, because the mouse talking to the cat in the first place is, I saw that as very irrational, but sometimes our rational thoughts are the most rational ones in the end, because when I started studying all this, I mean, I even now I still feel like I know absolutely nothing, but but I would go into something thinking the way that I would normally think, but it wasn't until I thought irrationally that I could discover something new that the author was probably trying to portray. So
I absolutely adore thinking about Kafka in terms of game theory and Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is a situation where if everyone is rational, you get a suboptimal result. So rationality actually is a bad thing. And really for game theory dynamics, you almost need irrationality, or what I like to call non-rationality, to avoid the suboptimal result. And Kafka is perpetually in his stories exploring how rational action, when autonomous, is actually irrational. It causes madness if you try to just be rational without any subscription to something outside of it, or how rationality can lead you deeper and deeper into a capture situation, or it gets you talking to a mouse and you get eaten. So I think a book that could be written would be the game theory through Kafka, because the Nash equilibrium in terms of Kafka, because I think that's a marvelous reading that you did, Sam, on that notion of rationality in the parable. I think that's really good. And I do see Emilio came in. I had a magnificent conversation with Emilio yesterday on economics, on all sorts of subjects. So Emilio, I hope you're doing well today.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I have a class at this. I have a new class, so I probably for the next several weeks I will not be able to join for the whole session. But yeah, I'm here. What did I miss? What are you guys talking about?
It's nice outside. We got we were actually talking a lot about the notion of philosophical developmentism that has been going on, how that seems tied to the question of escaping capture. The net, the end of Black Mirror, Kafka stories, things of that nature, and how that's figuring out the right ordering of which philosophers so that one can develop in the right way. So we've been working with a framework of, ego. Ego is developed in through a Kierkegaard or a Nietzsche into an I. That is then needing what we gain from a Heidegger of the ability to let beings be themselves, like come forth with suchness. That is then moved into a Buber I and you. And then the question of even identifying on a very deep level in a Hegelian sense, and how I think we follow Hegel, a Hegel structure, in that there's a necessary failure in each one of these steps, but that very failure has a sublimation that has advancement. And we also can see the legitimacy of the need for that structure, I think, if we bring in Dante, where this notion that God's hiddenness is actually necessary so that people aren't overwhelmed and killed, reduced to ask like Simli, as Beatrice talks about, and how there has to be this development so that one can adjust to handling the next phase. And if you skip a step, then you can be overwhelmed. It could be very, very problematic. So, if an ego tries to engage in ego you, that leads to pathologies. And, that's like Cadell will say a lot, that a lot of children are having children, or that children are trying to get married. And I associate that with the notion of egos having children, which then can create pathologies at different problems, as opposed to I's having children. But then if you have an I, but it's still engaging in I, it, not I suchness, to use that Heideggerian language, then one doesn't know how to hold the children per se, the being of the children, so that they can shine forth, or their own conditions. So each one of these are skills. And it's increasingly clear to me that metaphoric language of like philosophical equipment, philosophical gear, philosophical journey, these are metaphoric structures that could be helpful for thinking this. And I was also bringing forth a play on words on the idea that a lot of our conversations have, funny enough, been kind of about how this developmentalism is a way to escape Deleuzian capture, the end of Black Mirror, Kafka, or to escape the net of modern society. So, to escape the net of different things. So those were some of the topics we picked up on, Emilio.
Makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of I actually wrote a piece of published very, very short, that the other day I was walking, taking a walk with a roommate. She's older, she's in her 30s, and she has a boyfriend that she thinks he might be the one and stuff, and she's thinking about having children. And it was such a fascinating and enriching talk, because she was like really thinking through the motions of having children, because like for most people, having children is just like, okay, you have them, it's the natural like progress thing. But she was like, what if your child like has autism and you have to take care of him like your whole life? Or what if you like, she was like taking these things. And one of the things that for me like came up, or like um was that she said like, I don't know if I want like a child, because it's like a long commitment. It's like at least 18 years of their life. And I was thinking that that's such like I think like a contingent idea, because like also like most of my friends are like that are like younger, like are my age, like no, like kids like the world is like messed up, I messed up, like children's is like it's not like no, right? But for me it's weird, because I don't know but how you guys view it, but for me it's also like, in most cases people look at children like an eat, all like very specifically, like a thing that I have, like I'm responsible for, that like takes away my freedom and stuff. And all those things may be true, but I am but it's I think they look at it in the way that it's an object. Like you don't realize like there's like a whole human consciousness like being created and stuff. So I think that's really interesting, how people just think like they think in their children's in terms of themselves. Like having children, how will it affect me, right? Will it take away my time? Like, I won't have like, but they don't think of like they actually don't think about the children, right? They think about it in themselves. And I think um it goes through motions, I'm sure. But like here in Mexico, we have like my parents or grandparents, like they didn't have any philosophical reflection. They just had kids, did the best they can, love them, gave them like material, like education or life, etc., and that was it, right? So but for me it's funny how nowadays there's more reflection around having children, but it's around the the parent, not the child per se. So I think that's I don't know if it's because like there's more information, and therefore the like the type of problems or dilemmas that each generation faces is different. But I just think it really interesting. And because in a way you could say that this type of philosophical reflection, like maybe it's always been useful, but in earlier, like people didn't really need it, or at least seek for it, because they just run through the motions and they did a good enough job. Like they didn't question, they just like love your children, give them food, go to soccer practice. It was more kind of clear cut, right? But today I think we are required in these tools of resistance, these philosophical tools of resistance and of thinking, because it it is needed, or it is like it could be helpful for the pathology of that people experience nowadays. And I think that's why it's so useful, or so nowadays it proves this really useful to have like, yeah, to make a distinction between the ego and it, or I and it, or like I and such, as I believe you said. So yeah, I think it's I don't know how well it would be a matter of distribution, right? To communicate this to the people that need it. But I think like nowadays it's needed because of that complexity of life. And also I found like something interesting. Like before like Freud existed, like people didn't know like their own conscience. Maybe they had like a tic, like OCD, but they didn't realize they had it. Like almost all people nowadays like can diagnose their situation. Like almost all people say like, oh yeah, I'm a really angry person, or I'm nervous. Like almost all people all people know their pathologies, but they don't know how to treat them. Like what before was like the first step is to have diagnostic, right? To know what's wrong. But at least my impressions is like a lot of people have like self knowledge. They know about themselves and their pathologies, but they don't know how to do like that's it. They know, but they cannot like progress anything. So yeah, those are like the kind of reflection I had because of the themes that we're discussing in the talk. But yeah, that's why useful to talk about these topics. It feels like it's neither in a way, and you have the progression, because if you skip spaces, like you end up with the wrong ideas, as you said, and bad things happen. So yeah.
Yeah, everything's contextual, right? I mean, even pathologies, like the existence of these patterns of behavior have not always been described as pathological, right? To have claws as a cat in a room full of balloons is pathological in a sense, right? That there's all sorts of ways in which a developmental attribute or a capacity or a state of being can, in a different context, present itself as some pathological element. And then this presents a question, right? Do you change the environment to resuit yourself non-pathologically, or do you attempt to change yourself so that you no longer have the pathology? And it's always that dual question. People get stuck in it, though, like they get stuck in one or the other. It certainly, this is this question of resistance again, right? When I go inwards and I find that I can't change the fact that I have claws, metaphorically speaking, then it's an extraordinary resistance. So then I move back outwards and see if those claws can't actually affect some change out there, right? Maybe I just pop all the balloons. It's no longer a big deal anymore, right? It's no problem. That question right there is it is that distinction between what is required, what do I have to summon in order to affect some change so that I can reach some other, you brought up equilibrium, Nash equilibrium. I actually see culture as, in terms of economic theory, that equilibrium developing, right? So culture is the Nash equilibrium. Nevertheless, divergences are always occurring, right? There is always some irrational component at the edge of culture, which is questioning in that dual way. Do I change myself or do I change the culture, right? To reassert some greater chance, right? And this is that weird inner measuring process that who or what is improving with a change in circumstance, right? So rationally, I can try to make it based on my own interpretive stance, right? Improve myself, right? Some self-action, but I can also do the selfless action thing, right? I can irrationally attempt to self-sacrifice. Now we're doing like the Camus move, going down to the bottom and saying, well, like, what the only real philosophical question is this, what's the point of living? Yeah, and I'm always stuck there, like, strangely enough. I feel that the weight of that question all the time now. There's no, like, I could perceive this as quotidian, or it carries some extraordinary weight, right? And I tend to lean towards it carrying some extraordinary weight. It's just the weight of it is frequently veiled or hidden or implicit. And that inability to access that hiddenness or unwillingness to attempt to interrogate the state of things, to discover it. To simultaneously attempt to penetrate like those hidden things, but also be willing to receive, right? To be willing to trust the statements of the world, of others. Right? When that trust gets broken, right, like that ultimate questioning the question, right? Is the questioning even then worthwhile? If the answers are sometimes misleading. We find ourselves in a place where more than ever, our ability to attempt to persuade others utilizing dissimulation, it's there has never been a time where it's more prevalent, right? Or more powerful. And this is why I think Zoom meetings and these online spaces are in fact quite extraordinary places, because in some sense we're sidestepping this kind of autonomic function of interpretation and persuasion that we engage in the speech act. And it's different. It's not quite the same as when you and I are in this shared space. And so there's no threat of violence, for instance, right? Like, Daniel, if we have a disagreement, I can't run over and choke you out. Like, oh, you're gonna agree with me, right? Like, it's just not possible. I only have this speech act. And all those elements that I would naturally attempt to connect with embodied are short-circuited. So it does this move upwards thing. And that move upwards thing is, to me, like the continual development of the refinement of the subtleties with which we are observing and participating in that dual question of, do I change myself or do I change others? Right. So like the influence that I have in any given capacity, is it subtle, right? Is it forceful? Like, is it agile or strong? Like, there's all these elements to it that begin to be observed in this. So yeah, stop it.
Well, I wanted to comment on that very quickly. That gets back to what you were saying about the balance between presence and absence. You know, you were saying that every communication medium brings with it a different balance of presence and absence. The phone held to your ear is different from the video call, is different from the Zoom meeting. And there's a different distribution, per se, of presence and absence relative to the medium. What's very interesting, as a quick point, the first point is that Zoom is almost like a new instrument. Like, I think we need to not think of Zoom as in just a way to do conversation, but it actually is almost a new instrument that brings forth a new balance of presence and absence that makes a different kind of conversation possible, because people feel more comfortable, but they feel more present, but not too present to where they feel uncomfortable and like they're out there, but they feel like they can talk in a manner of which the conversation structure is different based on the feeling of the different distribution of presence and absence, of which Zoom affords that has not been available before. And I'm very interested in that, because I do think it actually allows what I've been calling the phenomenology of voice in ways that have not been allowed by other communication technologies. And that kind of being aware of that in a positive way actually could help us figure out how to go from the Nietzsche to the Heidegger to the Buber if we keep that framework. I wanted to quickly touch on Emilio. Emilio, there's something about, people will talk about the change of the traditional family to the nuclear family. And Michelle and Sam actually had a tremendous talk on the family and motherhood and children. And today, basically, people raise their children outside of a community. So they don't have as much help. And also it's not the beliefs of the community or the ways of thinking are not as given. So you almost have to own it, because you're encountering difference so regularly when you're more atomized, that when you have that level of difference encounter, the role of being philosophical becomes more pronounced, because it's not just given that everyone around you is Christian, or given that everyone around you is, say, Sufi, or so on and so forth. You're encountering difference, which then the child, we encounter it all the time. The child asks, why do you believe in God? Why do you think this way? Because they encountered this thing. So as the parents, you find yourself having to be more philosophical. And likewise, when you have such a increase in difference, whether it be on TV, even YouTube videos are different things. There's difference that they're now experiencing that they otherwise would not. That also brings out mental health more so. That also brings out philosophical issues and different things. So I think the movement from what's called the traditional family, which is where you raise kids, but you're surrounded by maybe grandparents and aunts and uncles, and you have more of a, or you're around people that have similar givens and other networks of families, has different philosophical and mental health requirements or conditionality versus a nuclear family. And I think that's one of the reasons, and Cadell will talk about the revenge of philosophy and philosophy having to come back because of this increased difference. So I think that's part of the part of the issue.
It makes a lot of sense, and actually that kind of tracks, because, like, for example, I think I'm not sure, but like the friends that I can think about that have these ideas, or that are more that could be more in need of philosophy of these reflections, because they are atomic, they are more, as you say, like, they contrast the difference more, so that they are in need of these types of reflection. I think it works well, because I also have friends that, because here in Mexico we have, like, big families compared at least to other countries. They used to be like way bigger, but they're still like big. So for example, I have cousins and they all live in like in a small town kind of way, and they at the very least when the talks I have with them are not the same talks I have with my friends because they live in a kind of like town. Like you go to the streets and you like say hello to people. Like all my grandparents still lives there. My uncles, my aunt. So it's like that kind of neat community, right? Actually, my uncle has like a 4-year-old, and sometimes he's like, I'm done. Like, and he lives my cousin with my mom, and she takes care of him for a while. So that's kind of that support structure, right? And that's like a more homogeneous like kind of yeah of thinking, and you don't have to question it as much. So I think that's like even in a practical example of life, I agree. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and regarding like the medium, like the medium is a message. I hope the message. I really love that idea. I think it's really, really powerful in itself, and I think it does change, like it does change the way we communicate, obviously. But for example, here in Zoom, we are having these conversation like in screens and stuff. But we can also share screen, right? So that's like another dimension of being like in our talk yesterday, we shared screen. So that's like a new component of way of thinking. That's different, right? Because if you're in person, like I can show you this piece of paper that and we can both look at it. That's the same idea behind like a Zoom thing, and you cannot do that on your phone. So it does change the way we communicate, but I think it's interesting because it's almost invisible, because you like when it's very obvious, you run through it. Like if you're on a phone and you want to show something, it's like of course you perceive the limitation of the medium, but normally we are just so in it that I don't think like it's really hard to notice or to grasp, even if you know the idea, I think, because like I love this thing that it's subtle and we don't have any way to know it. Like for example, I think it was a presidential debate. I don't know, it was like Nixon versus Reagan or something in the US, and they televised the debate, and they also like transmitted through radio, right? And they polled the people, and the people that heard it in the radio thought that Reagan won, for example, and the people that saw it on TV thought that Nixon won. And it was because each medium like benefited a different type of person, right? Because if let's say if you're taking more pauses, but in video you can have like this expression and mannerisms that will win over people because the medium allows it. But if you're hearing it on radio, you just hear pauses. You're saying like this guy maybe is insecure because he's not talking a lot, right? So like, but the people that experience that saw the debate versus heard the debate, like they don't know, right? It's such a subtle difference, and I think that it it does like it, and so we almost can only like feel the changes in reflection and comparison, because when the internet started, like people didn't know what it was going to do with the communication space. So now that we have the internet for a while, we can look back and see the type of things that specific tool of communication like promotes, and then we can say like, oh, okay, it's good, it's bad, or we can change these type of things because like the type of communication it pushes is not ideal, right? Or so I think the mediums we can only do it in retrospect, and I think that's useful because, but yeah, and exploring different mediums, yeah, different ways of thinking, and also like just to close the things I'm saying, I really like this thing that each technology has its own ideology behind, right? So like if for example if you are using blockchain, there's the ideology of verifying, right? That's like ingrained in the ideology of blockchain. But if you are the ideology of, let's say, like book is paper is almost like permanent, right? But because a book can exist like for hundreds of years, um and then we have like the internet and social media, and what type of that type of technology, what ideology it has, like maybe impermanence, maybe the ever present now, I don't know. But I think like each medium obviously has its own ideology behind it, and that affects the medium and the way we communicate. And yeah, I think that's a very fascinating topic because it's the lens at which we can do everything, right? Like this conversation can only happen because like Zoom exists, but if we're in person, it would be different, etc., etc. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Just a quick final comment. I think we're really close to solving all of this, whatever it is. It's great. And I do wonder, like, what is the question beneath all this? Like, what are the questions? Let's not assume it's one, right? Not to be too reductionist. What's participating in all of this? And the idea that you mentioned earlier, Daniel, that the different environments require different capacities, right? So if I want to exist in a feudal environment, I got to have some kind of divine right of kings, right? I got to recognize fealty. There, these really strong mythopoetic structures that have to persist within me, and this is the element that I want to bring into questioning or surface the question. It's this element related to memory and the capacity to hold in memory these incredibly abstract ideas, right, which were developed in concrete terms over a very long period of time. And so there's a dramatic difference, it seems, between capacities for memory, right, and the ability to hold these abstract structures. And that is what defines the ability to interpret and converse, right? So all of you wonderful people that have studied like the gamut of philosophical terms, like your ability to converse with others on that same level is extraordinary. But the amount of work that I need to do to catch somebody up to that place, right, to get them to where they can play with those concepts in memory without having to hold like the entire thread of historical development there so that they can understand it. That's an extraordinary ask. And so then we start to think about education, right? The role of education in terms of bringing people to the place where they can converse with each other, and what is necessary to reach that point. Is it really 12, 18, 24 years of study? Or can we reduce that, right? Can we take like the total space of desire to converse here and like throw it into a pot and then see what educational threads need to be explored briefly, right? So like, what if we gave each other homework, right? Something like that. Like we come back next week and it's like, well, look, here's the topics that are kind of in my head. And if you understand those, you'll understand a great deal about where I'm coming from, right? We all kind of like go to that place and recognize that implicit structure. It's already occurring partly, of course, just by virtue of the shared philosophical space, right? But it can be more targeted, I think, and you can dramatically upgrade your capacity in these spaces here as these additional tools allow to in real time educate ourselves I don't know, to our betterment, right? Like that's that question of like why do anything otherwise? We're tending towards some notion of betterment. At least that's, we can invert that. Like we can try to make it worse. There's some subtlety there too. Anyhow, yeah, I gotta go pick up my kids. It's great seeing you all, and wonderful discussion as always. Daniel, thanks for the invitation.
Tyler, always wonderful to see you. I always enjoy, thank you, always enjoy your presence. So thank you so much for being here and speaking, Tyler. Best to you, sir. There was a few things I was going on that question. It would seem that a lot of the explorations that we've done thus far are on questions of how to avoid capture, how to avoid ending up in the episode of Black Mirror where the revolution is mixed into the system. There seems to be something about cultivating intrinsic motivation, something about, but not you know, we talked about having to go through the Humean journey for that, something about cultivating the ability to experience beauty. I think wonder seems important, and it is kind of all under this umbrella. You could almost ask of what is philosophy, right? Like what is exactly philosophy that one is engaging in? And it seems as if in 2022, there's this increasing sense that philosophy has something to do with avoiding pathologies, neuroses. This gets into the psychoanalytical. It has something to do with a kind of development, a kind of learning to be with difference. And I was going to note, and then I'll pass it to Chetan. I also think what Tyler was saying about the outskirts having irrationality, that reminds me of Deleuze. That's where he gets into nonsense and trying to avoid. He had this sense where rationality can capture you. And so nonsense is how you avoid it. Now, my critique of Deleuze in a friendly way is that by doing away with epistemology as a representation in the dialectic, it becomes difficult to turn that irrationality into what I call non-rationality, that then becomes a way to avoid the Nash equilibrium. Now, that would be a larger conversation, but I think Deleuze, he didn't like Hegel. Now, I think he actually ends up being Hegelian without realizing it, in a sort of anxiety of influence sort of way. But there is that interesting question of philosophy today seems to be figuring out how to take the lessons of Deleuze there and to integrate them in maybe a different epistemology, because I'm not sure if his epistemology works. I would be more in favor of a Hegelian epistemology. And so taking the good of Deleuze and figuring out what does that look like so that we can figure out this movement from, say, ego to I suchness, I, you, I, and then, I/you, Buber, and then I, you, if we're just using those as figureheads of the development. So it seems to have something to do with that. But I think it's very important to ask that question. So I'll pass it to Chichan.
Hi, Daniel. I'll just quickly say this. Your questions about developmental really extremely interesting, and to bring that to the fore in some senses. I think the challenge over there is, and which we need to be thinking about within that space of things. And I'm not is that the history of development is always retrospective in nature. That is the nature of history in that sense. It always comes to you retrospectively. It's never something which will come to you in that. And that's one thing. Even this, if you look at Freud's thinking upon development, that always becomes a challenge, because when things are happening, they happen in almost non-linear ways, and they only make sense to us retrospectively in that sense. And that is the Hegelian problem of history also. So the challenge becomes that in what ways do we actually have a developmental account that can account for the retrospective nature of its own self? In that sense, it can encounter the contradiction of teleology itself. So this is a contradiction of teleology. That if it simply becomes something which is forward looking, you forget that the teleology itself is coming because you have to look back, and that kind of the challenge emerges in that sense. And this should not mean that we let go of developmentalism completely, like many philosophers have. Oh, if everything is non-linear, everything is, that also doesn't work. You need still an account of a way of thinking of growth in stages in some senses, because each person who has gone through it can recognize it in the other person. There is that level of recognition that always happens, and I think that's something we need to be thinking about it in some instances. Yeah, I just think thank you so much.
No, and then I'll pass it to Javier. That's an excellent point. For me, this actually screams why the entire structure itself in the movement of it is more Hegelian, because it has to tarry with the negative, stay in the now, and move by a kind of failure. Like I was talking with Philippe the other day, Dr. Nicholas, who's a Hegelian scholar, and we were kind of talking about the word, there's a management that Hegel has with learning to manage contradiction, but that word is problematic because it can sound like you know what you want to do, when really it's almost like a skill or ability to skill test, because it has to be emergent. So I appreciate that clarification, Chetan.
Yeah, I've been really appreciating this conversation, just listening in to this week. Actually, in my notes, I think that I'm kind of surprised we didn't talk about Heidegger's conversation about care. And it seems like a very that's the pregnant point here, is what Dasein's tending to is to have care. But particularly what Heidegger's worried about, or what I interpret his concern to be, is not this mechanistic, instrumental owning of being or observing of it and controlling it, but rather care, a kind of letting it be, an opening for aletheia to shine forth, right? The being to shine forth. And then I'm reminded of the kind of the tensions of basically authenticity, right? Basically for the they, when it comes to Heidegger's conversations against Dasein or in relation to it, but then in integrity, which I remember I was rereading some Old Testament stuff, and that comes up a lot, specifically for Job, where he's confronted with the incomprehensible catastrophe on his existence, where he's wishing he didn't exist, and he will not forsake God, but he's completely in the dark of the understanding of what's going on. But he constantly points to, I will never abandon my integrity. In terms of it seems to me the tension of what we mean by integrity. It's actually interesting because integrity is also one of the meanings when we look at Aquinas of what beauty is. There's proportion, there's a clarity, a luminosity, and then there's integrity that's actually important to it. So it's self-correspondence. What is that self-correspondence to? In my notes, I had it personally, actually with what Amelia was talking about with our relationships to children, generation of children, is basically what is the principle to which guides. So the question is not necessarily what do I want versus what change myself or change the other. It's also, but against what exactly? What's the thing which we're trying to gain integrity to? Is it a self-image of ourselves, or is it an expectation of the they onto us, or is it a third thing, a principle that guides that one self-submits to? Does that be a theological account on? These are just my meditations hearing from this week's conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I'd say it was interesting, Jock, and you're exactly right. This gets to the question of care and Heidegger. There's this thing where I've been talking like with Trey and Javier on this notion that Heidegger, there's not a lot of talk about relationships. Now, I use the language of relation, but I'm really talking more about relationships. And so now the internet wants to kill me. Basically, it's the kind of the idea that I forgot about Levinas and how Levinas kind of accuses Heidegger of being Dasein is antisocial. But the point I was making, it was like, well, you see, actually, yes, you can be antisocial in Dasein, but also you're antisocial if you don't go through Dasein, because you have to develop that care and that suchness to then bring back into the social so that you hold it in a manner that does not become pathological. So Heidegger becomes this kind of necessary road in the structure that we're talking about in order to be social, but there is a danger of, say, going into Dasein and staying in that anti-social, in the same way that there could be a danger of staying in a Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and that's what we're talking about. And then the kind of the meta question is what exactly, like Chichan's bringing up that's so good, is what is the nature of this development so that it is not top down, but it makes space for the other, it makes space for the emergent, and also has this understanding of failure. But I'll give it to Javier, and then anyone else, please feel free to speak.
I think, there's been a lot of like tensions between dichotomies going back and forth throughout a lot of this conversation. But I guess my comment would be like maybe like the complexity of the dichotomy is like we need to like stop thinking dichotomy and start thinking like entanglement. I like the word better, because then you start seeing like how it's not like this. And I actually picked this up from Buber when he talks about the I and it relation with I and thou. He's saying like it's not this like clear succession where you just go from I it, I thou. There's something profoundly entangled with that whole thing, right? And that's what I think that makes it I think that actually makes it more complicated, because it seems we think, oh, well, there's this succession from absence to presentness. There's this succession from here to there. But it's not like that at all. It's this entanglement. It's this twisting. And I think maybe that's what's wrong with Heidegger, is that he does this succession type of logic where there's this concealing and then revealing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, of course we're caught in the trap of language. Maybe he's not trying to say that. Maybe he's not trying to say that at all. Maybe he's really trying to express how entangled it really is. But yeah, that's just kind of like my thoughts on that sort of like observation. I think we could start thinking like entanglement, because I think like even like the nature nurture debate, it almost went there with Tyler. Tyler almost brought it up, right, with the you know, there's this changing of myself, and then the environment of like what was the context of this, the pathology and everything, nature versus nurture. But there is deeply an entanglement going on. And I think that's where I think you could say AB is like the representation of that entanglement, right? Yeah. All right, I'll pass it on.
Thought that was spark what you said, Javier, was that I do always find it interesting, like for example, when we make archetypes, we make opposites, right? We make like I don't know, like the strong person that's not like, for example, like the warrior that's just like physical skill but not like mentally developed, and then we have the mage, right? That is like very mentally developed but not like physical. So we always like we tend to make like antagonistics, like we like black and white, but there's also like brown and yellow and stuff. But we always, but even in colors, like we have this like the color thing, and we say like, oh, like yellow is opposite to purple, I think, and stuff. So like we always think in antagonistic, like in like yeah, like black and white and stuff, but not in the way that clear cut, but in the way that it's always antagonistic. So but I think like Javier said, it's kind of entangled, because of course it's useful sometimes to view something as like opposites, and sometimes indeed they are, but I think that for like in a way it's a preference of classification that you like specify on the opposites, and like and I think it happens like in a lot of like human things, like when we have a story, right? We have the good guy, we have the bad guy. Sometimes we have like a like gray person that's like neither good or bad, but the distinction between like opposites come like again and again. Like even Avatar, that's like a children's series. There's like fire, earth. Those are like the four elements, but they're like fire is like aggressive and stuff, and earth is kind of the opposite, like calm, tranquil. Like we always make these like these distinctions, and when we don't, it's weird because like for example, well, a lot of pop culture, but like in Frozen, there's in Frozen 2, there's elements that's I don't remember, it's fire, like ice and water and stuff. Like ice is an element, and you're like, what? That doesn't like ice is water, like, and and you're like that. No, that's bad screenwriting. That's not okay, right? But it's because we are so accustomed, like it has to be like like it fits perfect, like these archetypes, and it has to be the opposite. And you're like water and ice, like that doesn't make any sense, right? And I saw like people like the freaks about that, but it's precisely that, because we always want like these opposite things, this right? Like we don't have like water, ice, and fire. You're like that doesn't fit, right? That's not like those are not like opposite things and stuff. So yeah, I just want to throw that out, because maybe if we, and in computers like binary, like zeros and ones, like we see it like in some things, but then we go to like quantum computers, and then like it's superpositions, and then like, oh, okay, like it's different. Like we go to Frozen and we have water and ice as distinct elements, and then it blurs the line, and it can have these new paradigms of thinking, because we don't think in opposites that are maybe really useful. So yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Quick thought that popped into my mind when you said black and white, it made me think of how the color black is never really black, or like the color yellow or green or any of those colors. It's never really those colors. It's a mixture of a whole bunch of colors working together. And so that's what I thought of.
Because then that would even suggest that our notion of black and white are actually quote unquote virtual. You know, we think they're in the world, but actually they're just that way to us, which suggests that it's our brain that wants to think in black and white, not reality that's black and white per se. So that's just, I think, Javier, that word entanglement is very good. That's quite powerful. And indeed, I would associate that with AB ontology, to use that language, Hegelian. And it would seem, and for me, if being is in fact, if we use that general term, if being is in fact AB, then the epistemology that would follow is dialectical. That would be the epistemology that would follow from that ontology. But our brain is naturally not dialectical. And so we have to train it, and we have to work, and it is very, very difficult. And if we don't, then we end up ending up in a situation that our solution is a cat telling us change direction, and we get eaten. So we have to engage in dialectical thinking so we don't get into that situation to begin in. Another way that I would put this is that it would seem as if every phenomenon is a kind of Schrodinger's cat. And unfortunately, though, our brain naturally cannot think Schrodinger's cat, if you will, this bothness, this alive and death, dead. It's very, very difficult. The question I have, and then I'll bring this to a close, is does Zoom as a medium assist us develop the skill of thinking dialectically and thus operating closer to an AB ontology? Is there something about it that can do it? I think the dynamics of the phenomenology of voice unveil that everything is entangled. When you are in a conversation, you don't really have atomized individuals. They're all entangled. That's a really good word, Javier. And one of the reasons I think, as voicecraft does, examining the phenomenology of voice might be helpful in figuring out how to be more dialectical and how to live toward things as entangled, is precisely because it's examining the dynamics of entanglement that emerge in conversation and following through and seeing how they work. And to close, if we were to ask why this is important, I've been reading Battling to the End on Mr. Rene Girard, and Girard is very popular these days. And Girard basically makes the point that we are heading quite quickly toward the apocalypse because of mimetic desire, no longer having religion and the scapegoat mechanism to stopping that mimetic desire from escalating forever. And basically that's going to lead to the apocalypse unless we, figure out how to replace religion or bring religion back. I mean, he explicitly says Battling to the End is an apologetic book. It's like saying we have to bring back Christianity or something like that. Now, there are people who argue he turned toward more Eastern practices toward the end of his life because he believed Christianity wouldn't do it. That's another matter. But the point is, in order to escape mimetic desires, which comes from, if we say, the mirror neurons, seeing the world in terms of AB ontology, where they're not the same, like everything has an essential difference to it, and that therefore you can't perfectly mirror, would go a long way to working against mimetic desire and thus helping us avoid the Girardian apocalypse. So for me, there is something about these activities, or the point of what Tyler was getting at, that has also, in addition to the things that have already been said, ways to avoid or to bring about a new ontological consideration in epistemology to avoid that Girardian apocalypse. And another way to put this that might be more simple, there's this weird way that if like a foreign nation builds nukes, you have to build nukes, and then they go back and forth, and if people are building AI technologies, other people, it kind of feels like you're kind of trapped in this road of rationality you can't escape because of game theory dynamics. If they're building it, you have to build it, and then we're heading towards some technological that we don't even choose, some technological future that's just coming, the singularity that they talk about. Now, I'm not saying the singularity is inherently bad. I think it's conditional. I had that talk with Dr. Lass. It depends on if we're ready for it when we encounter it. But there's this notion that we're going to get there. And there's two options, basically. Either A, you figure out how to break that apart, or two, you figure out how not to operate according to mimetic desire so that singularity is not used in service of rivalry that then creates conflict and destruction, right? So, and that speaks, basically what that would suggest, following the Girardian structure, is that we are indeed in a hole, like the little parable that Kafka is talking about. We are in that situation, that the option of not entering that hole is not there, and we're heading toward the trap. We're heading toward it, and there's either two ways you avoid it. Either you figure out how to engage with the cat in such a way that it doesn't eat you, or two, you stop before you get down there. And I think some of the questions and the topics that are explored here in these conversations is about those two possibilities. And what is it about a net structure, the Zooms and so on and so forth, and new ontologies, new epistemologies that might be in service of avoiding an unfortunate circumstance where we find ourselves told how to escape our circumstance by the very cat that then eats us. So hopefully we can figure that out.